Okay. Howdy, folks. Welcome to part 3 of A Beginner's Guide to Public Speaking with me, Jack McCurdy, and Peter Chittum. This section, we are going to be talking about how to submit a great talk. And even I am very lucky to be sat in the room with Peter Chittum right now. Peter, your past experience as the lead for developer evangelism at Salesforce has seen you review and consider hundreds, maybe thousands of speaker submissions in your time. So if there's anyone more, there is no one more relevant than you.
Yeah, it could definitely be close to 1,000. So I, as part of the developer relations team, we went through and looked at every single developer-focused talk for Dreamforce and TDX. So TDX kind of came late to the game to have community talks, but Dreamforce was always something. And yeah, I mean, we would get easily upwards of 700-800 submissions for Dreamforce some years. And I didn't read through all of those, although there were a couple of years where I was responsible for the track, in which case I read a lot more of those. Let's just say. Yeah.
Yeah. Submitting to a conference, the number one thing for me, having submitted to Dreamforce, to TDX, to Dreamin' events, and even taking my ideas to a user group, the one thing that it all comes back to ultimately is an abstract. So I think it's important to explain what an abstract is. And the abstract is the description that is used to advertise your session to the conference attendees. So very often, Dreamin' and Salesforce events themselves will ask for an abstract that is usually between 200 and 500 words. And that is not a lot of writing space to effectively convey your idea, which is why I find abstracts are difficult to write.
Well, and for TDX this year, it was way shorter than that even, wasn't it? It was like 200 characters.
200 characters, I think it was.
It was like a tweet. You get a tweet to convince people to come spend half an hour listening to you.
Yes. So that is not a lot of space to convey a great idea. So there's a couple of things that I found really helpful in terms of, I've got an idea, this is what my talk's going to be about. How do I explain that to people in as few words as possible or as few characters as possible? Now, it's important to note as well, many of these conferences and Salesforce, if you submit to Dreamforce or TDX, does give you extra space, which isn't publicly visible when it comes to your session, to expand on your idea and explain why your talk would make a good presentation. So you will have that space in most submissions that you have to go into a little bit more detail and share with the organizers why this talk should be presented. So you will have that opportunity, but the abstract itself is really key to nailing it. Peter, what's your number one piece of advice for an abstract?
Oh, yeah. So my number one piece of advice is to treat it as a story. I am a big fan of thinking about all communication as storytelling. And I won't get into it here. I think it's better to talk about it in the preparing your presentation side. But there's a storytelling framework that I like to use. And storytelling frameworks, there's dozens of them. So, I've got one that I've decided works for me. If you've never heard of the concept of a storytelling framework, it is essentially the scaffolding or the structure that you choose to communicate an idea. That's all that it is. But yeah, I mean, an abstract is just a very short story. So treat it like that. Think again, I talked about audience at length in the last one. Your audience starts, you have to start with your audience and your idea, and keep your audience in mind when you're trying to communicate what it is that you're trying to communicate in your abstract. So yeah, tell a good story. That's my number one piece of advice. Mechanically,
yeah, go.
I have one little tip that I would say, and if you think about smaller conferences like the Dreamin' conferences, or, especially if it's like a user group or developer group, you can kind of go on and on in you can write a longer abstract, let me say, and people may have the time to read that. At a Dreamforce or a TDX, where there are potentially hundreds of competing talks for your one talk, you need to assume that your reader isn't going to read past your first sentence. Now, or another way to think about it is you have one sentence to get them to read the second sentence.
Yeah, what can you do to get them bought in as fast as possible?
Absolutely. And that's really hard because, some of the things that, we talk about in the guide about, being clear and compelling, but avoid clickbaity types of things. And, you have to be careful about being too gimmicky. There's all kinds of little traps you can get into. But if you can communicate clearly the what's in it for me for your audience in that first sentence, then you have a chance of getting the right person and the right audience into, to read your abstract and then, maybe actually to come and see your talk.
Absolutely. There needs to be value baked into it as well. What's in it for the audience? And your title that you have for the talk is almost approached in the same way. Your title needs to be clear about what the talk is about, and your abstract needs to be clear about the value. And I don't know if this is, I think what might be helpful is if I read the abstract that I wrote for one of the talks that I'm delivering this year at Mid-Atlantic Dreaming and Texas Dreaming, and the title of that talk is DevOps is more than just deployments. The abstract is deployments are undoubtedly a challenge, but there's far more to DevOps than that. Simply buying a deployment solution or tooling will only get you so far. Learn what you can achieve by adopting a DevOps mindset, as well as getting a full insight into the DevOps lifecycle to help you master the art of delivering and monitoring your Salesforce org. So if we take what we've kind of spoken about in terms of value and a bit of a story, I've addressed the story that many people do think DevOps is just the deployments. To develop DevOps in Salesforce has become synonymous with deployments. But in wider software engineering, DevOps is more than that. And in Salesforce now we're learning it's more than that.
Right.
But it's then tying that to the art of delivering and monitoring your Salesforce org and all of these parts of the DevOps, without diving into what the DevOps lifecycle is. There's so much that goes into that. And for me, this was when people think about DevOps tools, they traditionally have just thought about deployments. So that's what I was trying to buy into with not only the title, but the first line of that abstract, where I think it's been picked up by these conferences because it's resonant. People do think that way. And this challenges the status quo of what people are thinking. And that's how I came up with that abstract while thinking about the value and a little bit of a story there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. It definitely, another way to think about story is it's narrative, right? And that abstract has kind of a narrative that takes you through what are to be the key ideas of that. I think title is really, it is obviously the can be thought of it's the plaque that you're hanging outside the the shop to get people to notice you. So it does need to be clear and compelling, or it needs to convey an idea or a thought or an emotion um, it, it, and and something that will resonate. And going back to the command line talk, that title actually went through some evolution. When I first started giving the talk, it was called "Do Not Fear the Command Line. You're smarter than it," and that was fine. It definitely got good feedback, and people
Piqued some
seemed to enjoy
interest.
it. But I was never really super keen on it. For the one reason is that it assumes that the person is actually afraid, right?
Right.
And I always try and think of, if I'm going to communicate something in my title or abstract, if I am going to bank on somebody being a certain way, I'm also potentially writing off somebody who might actually benefit from hearing the ideas that I'm sharing. And so something like that, where it's like somebody's like, well, I'm not afraid of the command line, like they might just self-select out of it, even though there might be something useful for them. So after I had gone through this discussion with Mike Gerholt, because I was going to make some major changes to the talk, I also gave myself permission to rethink the title, even though I'd given it a few times. And the new title became, "If you can write a Salesforce formula, you can use the command line." I love that title because it is exactly the audience that I'm looking for, right? Salesforce admins write Salesforce formulas. That is just something that you do.
Yeah.
It selects every single Salesforce administrator, and it empowers them. It says, guess what? Like, if you already have this skill, you already know how to do this thing. You just don't know that you know. You just need someone to show you. And so I got so excited when I thought of that title, because to me it was so perfect at highlighting and zeroing in on the audience I was trying to reach. Now, unfortunately, I wrote that talk as a Salesforce employee, and so that is Salesforce's IP, which I am not permitted to go and use. But I wanted to keep sharing about using the command line for administrators. So I've actually just redone that talk, and it's a bit more gimmicky, but I've decided to call it terminal velocity. So because the terminal is obviously the app that you're running to run a command line when you're
Yes.
using that in so it's a bit more gimmicky, and it's not as good as the other title, which makes me a little bit sad. But at the same time, it actually gave me an opportunity to rethink how I approach the whole talk. And I used to just kind of jump right into, just right into actually using the command line and getting people to. What I didn't do is talk about why we call it a terminal and a command line. And so I decided to actually go back and give some background, because I think if you're coming to a technology, you don't necessarily understand. Sometimes there's a lot of history behind that for why it is the way that it is. And so anyway, so the title, I think, I still miss that title. But keep iterating on it, even if you've given it once or twice. If you come up with a better idea for a title, just go for it. If you can better attract people to your talk through a better title, rock on.
Yeah, absolutely. The key here is, well, and I'm caught in between two thoughts of what I wanted to say next, just based on what you said. But iteration and ideation is important for any part of a presentation or an abstract or a title that you're doing, and you will get rejected at some point.
Yeah.
From a conference and a speaking session. I've been rejected more times than I've been accepted to conferences, and I'm okay with that. The first one stings a little bit, but just because you've been rejected doesn't mean that your idea isn't valuable or that session is not valuable. That happens all the time. And sometimes it may be because the talk doesn't fit the particular theme that a conference is going for. For example, if you are submitting to Dreamforce this year, if your submission includes some aspect of AI or Agentforce or learn stories from Agentforce, your chances of success are probably going to go up this year in terms of getting your talk accepted. But that doesn't mean that being able to use the command line and Salesforce formulas are still really important in the day-to-day management of the organization. It might be a theme thing. There's competition is something that you mentioned. I don't know if it was in this video or if you mentioned it in the previous video, Peter, but there are often 50 spots at a Dreaming event conference, and they will receive over 300 submissions. That is not good odds of success. You know, it's not quite buying a lottery ticket, but the chances of success when there is so much to learn, with the platform growing, there's so much information and knowledge out there. So don't be discouraged by the rejection, and reuse and reframe that idea. If you have been rejected, see if you can get feedback. You might not always get it from the organizers. Just say, thanks for letting me know. Really appreciate the opportunity to submit. Can you give me any more feedback on why this session wasn't accepted? And they might well tell you and get feedback from people. The other thing to do as well is, if you are thinking of submitting to a conference, for any conference, the agendas are usually up on their website. So you can see the titles of talks and the abstracts of talk. Even if you're not attending that conference, go and read through all of the sessions that are being presented and think, which ones am I interested in? Why am I interested in that? And what has engaged you? And that will close that feedback loop a little bit when you think about creating your own abstracts, talk titles, etc.
Yeah. There was a thought that just went through my head that came through and then left. Speaking from the perspective of having curated and been in the selection process for many tracks, it can be. I would say that there's always a fair number of submissions that either it looked like they were phoning it in, they just didn't put the effort, or too disorganized, or just too much information. If you send me a book's length of explanation, and I would say a lot of conferences have gotten better about keeping that a bit penned in, and stopping from people submitting 2,000 character long explanations for why their talk is amazing. If it takes you 2,000 characters to convince me, I'm already not convinced, is kind of where I stand when I'm going through and doing session selection. I mean, you may get through if it's an amazing idea and you can hook me early on in that, but you really have to be bringing something amazing to get me to read 2,000 characters. And I'm not kidding here. I have had submissions like this. You really have to be bringing something amazing for me to read something 2,000 characters long when I've got 700 other sessions to go through and select. So you're not actually helping yourself by writing too much, And kind of going back to, I remember what I wanted to say, going back to what you were saying about rejection. There's a sporting phrase or analogy that gets used in situations like this that I really like, which is, you miss every ball you don't swing at, right? And that's just it. If you're going to be in the game, you're going to lose sometimes, and so it's just accept that and come up with your own strategies for like for dealing with that. Like rejection sucks. Nobody likes to be told no. There was a community conference I submitted to this year that I thought I had a pretty good chance at, but I wasn't selected. And even still, many, many years later and many, many talks later, I was still like, damn, that sucks. It doesn't feel good.
It does suck. It does suck.
So come up with your strategies. You're like, if you get rejected, maybe buy yourself something nice, if that works for you. Sweeten the disappointment in some way so that you can kind of get back on the horse and try again. I think that's enough analogies for that message there.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is when you're submitting to many of these conferences, there is a very low likelihood that you are going to be rejected because it's you.
Yeah.
The conference organizers, and I think this is fairly universal now across every Dreaming conference, is they do something called blind reviews. So whilst you're in the submission process, you have to put your name and your email address and some identifiable information into that submission process, but that's so they can contact you afterwards. What the organizers will do is judge the sessions based solely on title, abstract, and the explanation that you have given. So if you do have worries, fears, or concerns that you've been rejected because it's you, that is 9 times out of 10 not the case, because these submissions are reviewed, like I say, blind, without that identifiable information. So it truly is on the merit of what you write and how well you're able to communicate your idea and the value your talk will bring to the community that will get you that success.
Yeah, and I can't speak for community conferences. I've never been on the session organization side of those, but for the Salesforce conferences, there isn't just one person who's saying yes or no. There are stakeholders that get pulled in from across developer relations, product, technology, services. There's a lot of effort gone into to find experts in the areas that the talks are in, to judge them based on the proposal only and not the person. So, the title, the talk abstract, if you get that extra, tell us more about your talk field that sometimes is there, spending a good amount of time refining what you're saying and maybe getting some objective criticism of that from someone who you trust, especially if you feel like you've got a good idea and you don't want someone to run away with it. I can understand some people maybe feel very protective of their idea before they've actually gone in and done it, but get some outside opinion on that, and make sure it's really tight, and that's going to give you your best chance at being accepted. And if not, just don't take it personally, move on. The best known, most prolific speakers have all been through rejection too.
There you go. Hopefully that gives y'all some idea about how to submit a great talk, and we see you on a agenda sometime soon.